So I hope everyone had a really great lunch. And we're going to have our afternoon panel on the legacy of nuclear use and testing, a call for justice. My name is Ciobanu. I'll be your moderator for this panel. I'm the Policy and Advocacy Director of the Nuclear Age Peace Foundation, Project Coordinator for Reverse the Trend, NAPF's Youth Initiative, and I also serve as the TPNW Advisor for the mission of Kiribati. Many hats. So I thought before we start to provide a very clear and succinct definition of what is nuclear justice. Nuclear justice aims to address the harms caused by nuclear weapons and testing, seeking justice for affected communities through victim assistance, environmental remediation, and the pursuit of a world free of nuclear weapons. Nuclear justice calls for governments and organizations to take responsibility for the harms caused by nuclear activities and to provide adequate compensation and support to affected communities. This includes ensuring, and there's also demand for justice and redress, ensuring access to health care, clean environments, and the right to participate in decision-making processes that impact the lives of affected communities. Nuclear justice also seeks to mitigate the harm inflicted on countries that have experienced the use or testing of nuclear weapons and to ensure that such victims are never created again. What we do at the Nuclear Age Peace Foundation, in collaboration with the missions of Kiribati and Kazakhstan, is that we advocate on the TPNW, in particular Article 6 and 7 of the treaty, which deals with victim assistance, environmental remediation, international cooperation, and assistance. And we primarily focus on the establishment of an international trust fund to help victims of nuclear testing and use, as well as to address contaminated environments. In addition to our work on the TPNW, we also advocate for nuclear justice at the NPT meetings, so that's the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty meetings, including its preparatory committee meetings, as well as the review conference. In addition, in the first committee of the UN General Assembly, we collaborate very closely with progressive member states on addressing the legacy of nuclear testing. We often ask our wonderful interns to help us, Stella's one of them, to really focus and to engage with states in the first committee to support key resolutions, including Kiribati and Kazakhstan's resolution on addressing the legacy of nuclear weapons. This resolution, which is historic, calls for an international meeting to be held in 2026 on the legacy of nuclear weapons, looking at victim assistance and environmental remediation. And this is the first time that the UN will have such a meeting focused on victim assistance and environmental remediation. And we have invited member states to share relevant experiences in addressing the harm caused by nuclear weapons. So it's our hope as we move forward to really encourage the user states such as the United Kingdom, the US, and France to participate. Because even though they often disagree on the provisions regarding victim assistance and environmental remediation, they nonetheless attend the meetings, at least in the General Assembly setting, to express their concerns, but also to share their thoughts and perspectives. So at least it's a process to have a dialogue with them, and that's the purpose of the international meeting, to begin that crucial dialogue. On that note, I would like to invite our first esteemed presenter, Véronique Christory, who's the Senior Arms Advisor for the ICRC. Since 1997, she's participated in all negotiations related to weapons issues at the UN, including the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. She inspired a play on nuclear disarmament entitled Talking About the Fire by Christory, and she's also the co-recipient of the 2024 Women Waging Peace Award from us, from the Nuclear Age Peace Foundation. She'll be talking about no capacity to respond to nuclear weapons use. Please.
Thank you very much, Christian. So, good afternoon. It's quite difficult to, after a wonderful lunch, to delve in the huge issue of the humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapons. But I hope that I will keep you awake with what I will have to say. First of all, I would like to thank the Nuclear Age Peace Foundation and Soka Gakkai for organizing this Choose Hope Symposium. Hope is much needed, and we are here to contribute to it. So I am from Switzerland, but I have a special connection to Santa Barbara, and I am delighted to be with you. As Christian said, I was very honored last year to receive conjointly with Ellen White, that is here, the Women Waging Peace Award from the Nuclear Age Peace Foundation. And I am also delighted to have joined the board of the NAPF. At last but not least, as Christian mentioned, the US premiere of the play that I have inspired about nuclear disarmament, called Talking About the Fire by Christory, was performed in Santa Barbara. Thanks to the Nuclear Peace Age Foundation again. Now it's touring in the UK. It was performed in Oslo, the night of the Nobel Peace Prize awarded to Leon Ilyenko at the Nobel Peace Prize Center, and it will be in Berlin next month. So we need to go and meet people where they are and to engage in serious conversation. I will devote my presentation in 3 parts. A few words on the history and the International Committee of the Red Cross, because I think that it's important to understand why the ICRC has been involved since the beginning in a call on nuclear disarmament. Then I will also address why it's so important to focus on the humanitarian impact of nuclear weapons, and at last but not least, would we be able to assist in case of a nuclear weapon use? If or where deterrents fail and nuclear weapons are used, regardless of if it's deliberate, by miscalculation or accident, at that point, really, it won't matter. We need to address the plan B and the humanitarian consequences and the response. And I think that is a very important point. So, talking a little bit about the International Committee of the Red Cross, is the oldest and largest humanitarian organization founded by Henri Dunant in 1863. The ICRC has been awarded 4 Nobel Peace Prizes, including the first one when the Nobel Peace Prize was created in 1901, and Henri Dunant, the founder, received it with Frédéric Passy, a French pacifist. Then the ICRC received it, and it's also important, the dates, in 1917, during World War I, in 1944, during World War II, and in 1963. We are the most awarded organization. As you may know, the ICRC assists and protects people in armed conflict and develop international humanitarian law or the law of armed conflict. We are present in almost 100 countries. The headquarters is in Geneva. Switzerland is a depository of the Geneva Convention and the additional protocol. And the ICRC is in a way the guardian of international humanitarian law. And that's why also we have a special status at the UN. We are a permanent observer. We develop with states new treaties that regulate and prohibit certain weapons and methods and means of warfare. It is a very important point. when the ICRC is recommending the development of new instruments on weapons, it's because we have witnessed firsthand the impact of these weapons in the battlefield, with huge humanitarian impact like mine, cluster munition, chemical weapons, as well as nuclear weapons. That's why when the ICRC proposed new treaties, states consider them seriously, even if they don't agree with everything we propose. I will mention one exception. It's blinding laser weapon. Perhaps you never heard of it, and it's normal, because it was the first time that we were able to ban a weapon before it was fully developed by this country. And it's called the famous Protocol 4 of the Convention on Unconventional Weapons, and it was negotiated in 1995. And because, states, okay, they were developing this permanently blinding laser weapon, and then we said that there is no way that they will be used on the battlefield and blinding millions of people. So it was one case we could prohibit a weapon before it was on the battlefield. And there is another exception, and I will refer that what Eduardo said from Mexico is on autonomous weapon system. And I am doing a parenthesis because I think that everything is linked and is very important. So the ICRC president and the UN Secretary General are calling on states to negotiate a new legally binding instrument on autonomous weapon with a two-pronged approach: the prohibition of an autonomous weapon that targets humans and the regulation of other autonomous weapon systems. It's what we call international humanitarian law in action. We hope that to have this treaty adopted before, we must deal with the humanitarian impact of this system on the battlefield. And I really want to stress that it's not the topic of the discussion today, but we are at another crossroad in the history of humanity with the development of this autonomous weapon system or killer robots. So let's go back to nuclear weapon. Why it is so important to focus on the humanitarian impact of nuclear weapon? Because nuclear weapons pose some of the most profound questions about the extent of human suffering we are willing to inflict or permit in war. It is really critical to refocus the debate on what a nuclear weapon use will mean for civilians and combatants, and for the natural environment on which we all depend. As you know, it's important to never forget history. The ICRC, as I mentioned previously, witnessed firsthand the devastating impact of nuclear weapons in 1945. I would like to begin by reading a recount of Dr. Marcel Junot of the ICRC, who arrived in Hiroshima after the nuclear bombing. He was one of the first foreign witnesses and doctor on the site. So I quote, "In a few seconds, thousands of human beings in the street and garden in the town center, struck by a wave of intense heat, died like flies. Others lay writhing like worms, atrociously burned. All private house, warehouse disappear, as if swept away by a supernatural power," unquote. With doctor, nurse, the Japanese Red Cross, they try in near impossible conditions to assist the dying and injured. Hospitals were in ruins. There were no medicine, no bandage, no blood transfusion. Out of 1,000 patients who had taken refuge to the Hiroshima Red Cross Hospital on the first day, 600 rapidly died. 80% of doctors and 90% of nurses were killed in Nagasaki. As we gather today, the Japanese Cross Hospital continue to treat daily many thousands of survivors who are suffering from cancer and other diseases like exposure to nuclear radiation. Today, we know even more about the long-term poisonous effect of nuclear weapons. We cannot allow a repetition of the dark part of our past. We owe it to the survivor, the Hibakusha, to ensure that the horror they suffer are never repeated. It goes without saying that it also encompasses all the victims of nuclear tests. First, second, third, and even fourth generation of people are affected by nuclear radiation and suffer the physical and psychological trauma of nuclear weapon use and test. This is quite unique and it's unacceptable. In ICRC view, it's extremely doubtful that nuclear weapons could ever be used in accordance with the principle and rule of international humanitarian law. Moreover, the use or threat of use of nuclear weapons is abhorrent to the principle of humanity and the dictate of public conscience. These are enshrined in the preamble of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. So the ICRC, witnessing firsthand the impact of nuclear weapons, made the first call in September 1945, even before the first resolution at the General Assembly. Since then, we have continuously called on the prohibition and the elimination of nuclear weapons. So we needed to be very patient and very determined, like many states and civil society. And we were also part of the discussion on the non-proliferation treaty. We participate every year at all the PrepCom and then at the review conference and trying to bring the humanitarian consequence of nuclear weapon to the discussion and to the table. And in 2017, the ICRC participated in the negotiation of the treaty. And I was very honored to be a part of the team that negotiated the treaty with Ellen White. And the role of the ICRC is even mentioned in the preamble of the treaty, as well as the role of civil society, the UN, and the Hibakusha. This is really an historic achievement. We made the impossible possible. And I want to reiterate this sentence. We made the impossible possible. We prohibited the last category of weapon of mass destruction after chemical and biological weapons. And for the first time, for weapon of mass destruction, there are positive obligations. And that also, it's a huge victory. There are articles on victim assistance and environmental remediation, and that usually it was only dealt on conventional weapon, on what we call humanitarian disarmament. It was for the landmines and cluster munition, and also the negotiation on the Arms Trade Treaty, but it was the first time that it was linked with weapon of mass destruction. And the role of women and the gendered impact of nuclear weapons, they are also enshrined in the treaty. That it's really a huge victory, and as Hélène and others said, it's really thanks to the important role of civil society that brought together this victory. The entry into force of the TPNW is an answer to the call made 5 decades ago by the state that concluded the NPT to prevent, I quote, the devastation that will be visited upon all humankind by a nuclear war. So even the states from the NPT to begin with, they knew what it means to have a nuclear war. There are several pathways to nuclear disarmament, but prohibition is an essential step. Through prohibition, it creates a disincentive for proliferation. And I think that it's also a very important aspect. Through prohibition, it creates a disincentive for proliferation. Now, what we will be able to assist people in case of a nuclear weapon use? So providing effective medical assistance following a single detonation of medium-sized atomic bombs in Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945 were almost impossible. Today, it will be even more difficult. So backing how we how we were able to say that it will be almost impossible. So in 2020, the International Committee of the Red Cross and the Federation of the Red Crescent and the Red Cross Society convened an expert meeting on the humanitarian impact and risk of the use of nuclear weapons with 45 states, including some nuclear weapon states, scientific experts, and the UN to discuss this issue. And in April last year, the ICRC, the Norwegian People Aid, the Norwegian Red Cross, and the Belgian Red Cross organized the Nuke Expo, the Science Expo on nuclear weapon risk and humanitarian impact. The Nuke Expo was held in Brussels and in Oslo, and we hope to bring it to New York and elsewhere in the US, around the globe, in Japan, in Paris, London, Delhi, Islamabad, Pyongyang, Beijing, and Moscow. Let's dream big. And I will not reassure you. Among the key findings of this meeting, as you may guess, there is no state or international organization which could address the immediate humanitarian emergency, nor the long-term consequences of a nuclear weapon detonation, nor provide appropriate assistance to those affected. So, owing the massive suffering and destruction caused by a nuclear detonation, it will be probably not possible to establish such capacities, even if attempted. However, coordinated preparedness may nevertheless be useful in mitigating the effects of an event involving the explosion of an improvised nuclear device. The scale of destruction and contamination after a nuclear detonation in or near a populated area could cause profound social and political disruption, as it will take several decades to reconstruct infrastructure and regenerate economic activities, trade, communication, healthcare facilities, and schools. And I encourage you to look at the excellent ICANN report, No Place to Hide, Nuclear Weapon and the Collapse of the Healthcare System, that took the example of almost 10 cities in the world, including nuclear weapon states, and how they will not cope with the healthcare system because basically nothing will function. The immediate and long-term humanitarian and environmental consequences of nuclear weapon use and testing continue to be the subject to scientific research with evidence and analysis of the sex and age-differentiated impact of ionizing radiation on human health, the long-term impact of nuclear weapon testing on the environment, including on mortality and infant mortality rates, the consequence of a nuclear war on the global climate addressed by the nuclear winter, food security, ocean acidification, as well as evidence analysis of regional preparedness and response measures to nuclear testing. So it was a very wide range of issues that we address, while there are some aspects of this impact that are not fully understood and require further study. This scientific study revealed that new and compelling evidence of long-term harm to human health and the environment from the use and testing of nuclear weapons. So the ICRC message is clear: what we cannot prepare for, what we cannot respond to, we must prevent. And this message was reiterated in a very rare joint statement by the ICRC president and the president of the Japanese Red Cross, ahead of the G7 summit in Hiroshima last year. As other people attending this amazing symposium, we are coming from the third meeting of States Party of the TPNW, and we convey all these messages and we address all these issues. So it was in a sense, an important meeting. As I was part of the delegation of the ICRC, we are also working on the universalization of the treaty as well as its implementation. And I would like to mention also the importance of the role of the Red Cross and Red Crescent National Society, as they will be, in the case of use of nuclear weapon, the first responder. So the female, like Annie mentioned, so we will be really the first one called to address the humanitarian consequences. And for a long time, for political reasons, some states, even their national society, didn't want to address this issue. And for example, but let's be hopeful. For example, the American Red Cross attended last year meeting and attended this meeting in New York, and it's very important. You know, for the first time in 80 years, the American Red Cross and the Japanese Red Cross organized a youth meeting to talk about nuclear weapons. 80 years. For the yeah. Thank you, the youth. The American Red Cross, for the first time, focused its Youth International Humanitarian Law national program on nuclear weapons this year. Things are changing. There is hope. I know that the Christian patient, I am trying to finish, and I would like to. And I would like to say a few words as a mother of 4 young children, not 4 young people, 4 young people. They will not like to be. So, for the record, they are 25, 23, 22, and 19. So, and during the negotiation of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, listening Setsuko Tolo on her poignant and terrifying testimony being in Hiroshima during the atomic bombing, I was in tears. She was 13 years old. She was the age of my youngest daughter at that time of the negotiation. It could have been my children in Hiroshima or Nagasaki, or your children. The young generation did nothing to cause the problem of nuclear weapons. It has been inherited from previous one. A solution to the nuclear weapon problem required the imagination, the ambition, and the courage of the new generation. The creativity of the young generation through policy, art, writing, theater, music, movie, and poems. And I also would like to mention a study that the ICRC did prior to the war in Ukraine and prior to COVID. And it's called Millennial on War. The ICRC conducted a survey with 16,000 young people in 16 countries, 8 countries in armed conflict and 8 countries at peace. And so I will just give you just a couple of numbers that are very striking. 80% of the millennials surveyed believe that the use of nuclear weapons is never acceptable. At the same time, almost half of the millennials believe that nuclear weapons are an effective instrument of deterrence. And millennials are very nervous about their future. And it was prior to COVID and the war in Ukraine and everything that is going now. And 50% believe it is likely that a nuclear attack will occur in the next decade. In closing, accepting nuclear weapons as an indispensable instrument of security is an indefensible, dangerous logic. Most states today see nuclear weapons as a major source of insecurity for their population and for future generations. For the sake of the survival of humanity, we must free the world of weapons that threaten catastrophic humanitarian consequences and irreversible harm. The only way to guarantee that nuclear weapons are never used again is by eliminating them, and their prohibition is an essential step for reaching this goal. As Setsuko Taro said at the adoption of the treaty, nuclear weapons has always been immoral, now they are illegal. The nuclear weapon debate must ultimately be about people and about the collective future of humanity. It's crucial to continue to shape the narrative and to place humanity at the center of the nuclear debate. It's crucial to have a human-centered approach of security. Let me conclude by a quote from Henri Dunant. Only those who are crazy enough to think that they can change this world can do it. Let's do it. Let's choose hope. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Véronique. And thank you for sharing about the historic telegram that was transmitted regarding the catastrophic and humanitarian and environmental impact of the atomic bombing in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Next, we will hear from Anna Ikeda, who is a representative to the UN for Disarmament for Soka Gakkai International. She's also a campaigner for the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, ICAN, and Stop Killer Robots, where SGI serves as an international member, and she also serves on the executive committee of the Voices of a World Free of Nuclear Weapons, which is part of the United Religions Initiative. She'll be talking about the lessons from Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Please.
Well, thank you, Christian. And I'd also like to start by thanking our friends at the Nuclear Age Peace Foundation, my fellow presenters, all of the speakers, and all of you here today. Thank you so much for being here today. It's an honor for me to participate in this Choose Hope Symposium to carry forward the work of two individuals that I greatly admire, David Krieger and Daisaku Ikeda, whom I also had the personal privilege of knowing. And just in case you're wondering, my last name is Ikeda, but I'm not related to Daisaku Ikeda. I've already been asked twice today, so just wanted to clear that out from the question and answer session. But in all seriousness, it's been estimated that by the end of 1945, the atomic bombs had killed more than 140,000 people in Hiroshima and more than 70,000 in Nagasaki. It's so easy to talk about it as statistics, right? But each person had a name, like Harumi Ato, Kazue Nozaki, Takuro Oshita, Makie Imai, and Hiroshi Yamane. Each of them had family and loved ones and aspirations for the future, like Wada-san talked about yesterday. Each person deserved to live. And in the decades that followed, those who survived the bombings faced unimaginable challenges due to the health effects of radiation, psychological trauma, and the guilt of surviving that was mentioned yesterday as well, and the grieving, the losses of loved ones. Some of them just perished instantly and never found. They faced social stigma, although it wasn't their fault that it happened. In earlier days, there wasn't sufficient understanding of the effects of radiation, and many believed it could be contagious, for example. Some were called lazy because they would get so fatigued and could not work. In last year's Nobel lecture, Mr. Terumi Tanaka, one of the co-chairs of Nihon Hidankyo, relayed his personal testimony. He stated, and I quote, "I found the charred body of one aunt at the remains of her house 400 meters from the hypocenter, along with the body of her grandson. a university student. The other aunt's house had collapsed and become a pile of wood. My grandfather was crouched down on the brink of death with severe burns all over his body. My aunt had been severely burned and died just before we arrived. We then cremated her remains with our own hands. My uncle, who was initially mostly unharmed, had left the area to seek help. Yet we later learned that he had collapsed at a rescue station and died after suffering from a high fever for a week. Thus, one single atomic bomb transformed 5 of my relatives so mercilessly, taking all of their lives in one fell swoop. The deaths that I witnessed at that time could hardly be described as human deaths. There were hundreds of people suffering in agony, unable to receive any kind of medical attention. I strongly felt that even in war, such killing and maiming must never be allowed to happen, unquote. Mr. Tanaka's lecture also detailed the hibakusha's decades of advocacy to seek justice for the losses and damages they've suffered. Despite some laws that have been enacted in Japan since the late 1950s to address some of the health concerns of the hibakusha, they have not been offered any compensation to this date. And there are some who are still seeking justice. For example, individuals known as Black Rain victims who experienced the 1945 atomic bombings outside the government-designated areas. My organization, Soka Gakkai International, has collected many testimonies of hibakusha and published them through books, videos, and articles. In Japan, our organization also offers forums where participants can listen directly to the testimonies of the hibakusha, whose average age, as you heard, is now 85. Inspired by their initiatives, some other national Soka Gakkai organizations, like in Mexico and Italy, also initiated activities to raise awareness of the devastating impacts of nuclear weapons and stories of the hibakusha in their national context. Through such opportunities, the younger generations are able to learn about the sufferings experienced by the hibakusha, the issues about compensation and their fight for justice, and their deep desire for peace, that nobody else should suffer what they had to go through. In 2014, right after I started working for SGI's Office for UN Affairs, which is the current job I have, I also met Ms. Setsuko Toro that Véronique just mentioned. It was at a conference in Vienna, in Austria, toward the negotiation of the TPNW. And as you heard, Setsuko is also a Hiroshima A-bomb survivor and a world-renowned activist. And she was one of the people who received the 2017 Nobel Peace Prize on behalf of the international campaign to abolish nuclear weapons. And she was 13, as you just heard, when the bomb was dropped. And at that conference, she shared a story of why she decided to dedicate her life to nuclear abolition by telling her story, which is actually a conscious decision made by not every A-bomb survivor. So the story goes that Setsuko arrived in Virginia in 1954 to pursue higher education. And after her story about Hiroshima and her thoughts on nuclear weapons was published by a local newspaper, she found herself receiving death threats and hate letters, telling her to go back to her country. So alone in a foreign country as a young woman and shocked by the hatred, Setsuko had to stay with her professor for a while to ensure her safety. So she had to make a decision. Do I continue to speak out, or do I become silent? And fortunately, we know the outcome, what kind of decision she made. But as she looks back at those days, she said that they helped her renew her commitment as an activist. Setsuko realized that her identity as an A-bomb survivor had to be the central core of her being. So when I hear stories of the hibakusha like Setsuko's, Miss Wada's, and Mr. Tanaka's, I cannot help but reflect on my own commitment to nuclear abolition. Am I in it until the day that we see every nuclear weapon is eliminated from this earth? What can I do to respond to their courageous efforts? I don't take it for granted that they share their stories over and over. I know that's so painful. Daisaku Ikeda stated, quote, "We need to awaken to a common consciousness of being all inhabitants of Earth. This consciousness is not to be found in some distant place. It will not be found on a computer screen. It lies in our hearts, in our ability to share the pain of our fellow human beings. It is the spirit that says, as long as you are suffering, whoever you are, and whatever your suffering may be, I suffer also." If a nuclear weapon is used, either by design or by accident, it will affect all of us. Therefore, the fight for nuclear justice is the fight for all of us. Nuclear justice transforms us all. I believe that working to bring justice to those who have suffered the most brings us closer to the truth that each person deserves to be treated with dignity. Nuclear justice brings us together, unlike nuclear deterrence that divides us versus them, which is also an illusion. It heals us all. Nuclear justice means establishing a clear public opinion that using, testing, or threatening to use nuclear weapons cannot be justified under any circumstances. It means creating a world where people have the imaginative empathy to become concerned about whose security might be sacrificed in the name of national security, and you will hear some of the stories later in this panel. We know that our journey will be long, but I found the following exchange between Daisaku Ikeda and David Krieger in Choose Hope very encouraging. Ikeda said, and I believe it's in page 75, "The fate of the two cities, Hiroshima and Nagasaki, has more to teach than pain and remorse. Hope can be found in the strength with which the people restored their cities." And David responded, "The human spirit is remarkable. It has the power to recover from even the greatest tragedy. It can discover hope in places where logic tells us there's none. A flower rising from the ashes of destruction symbolizes it best. If delicate flowers can bud and blossom from the ruins of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, we human beings too can rise from such destruction and tragedy," unquote. Isn't that poetic and also very true, right? I really miss both of them. Because of the persistent efforts of the hibakusha and people from the affected communities, the nuclear taboo has been maintained. And today, we have the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, supported by 94 signatories and 73 states parties. It is our responsibility, each one of us, to ensure nuclear weapons are eliminated from our planet. So, in terms of creating hope, David once told me, because I asked him, I think I first met him about over 10 years ago, and I asked him, "You've been in this work for over 30 years. How do you keep going without going insane, right?" And he said, "It's because I take action every day. That's why I don't lose hope," right? So if anything, let us take action, and it doesn't matter what you do, the action will keep us going. So let us take the stories from this symposium in our hearts and share them with the world, and let us share their call. No more Hiroshima, no more Nagasaki. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Anna, for your very powerful presentation. Really moved me. Next, we will hear from Dr. Togzhan Kassenova, who is who's based in Washington, D.C. She's a senior fellow at the Center for Policy Research at the University of Albany. She's the author of the award-winning book entitled Atomic Step: How Kazakhstan Gave Up the Bomb, and a former member of the UN Secretary General's Advisory Board on Disarmament Matters. She'll be sharing the story of Kazakhstan. Kazakhstan is located in Central Asia and experienced more than 450, thank you, nuclear tests, and recently chaired the third meeting of state parties on the TPNW, which concluded last Friday. So please, Dr. Kassenova.
It's incredibly meaningful for me to participate in the Choose Hope Symposium during this, I think, exceptionally challenging time. And especially living in DC, we feel it every day on every level, but I'm sure it's, everybody in the country, but also beyond. In my today's remarks, I'll focus on two parts. First, I'll tell you a little bit about Kazakhstan's nuclear story. And in the second part, I want to share my take on what nuclear justice might mean for the Kazakh people, the communities that were affected by the Soviet nuclear tests. Kazakhstan's nuclear history is a story of extreme hardship, but it's also a story of resilience and hope. The Soviet nuclear tests that were carried out for 40 years inflicted unbelievable harm on the environment, the people, and the animals. People suffered and continue to suffer from a wide range of illnesses, of course, many cancers, body deformities, but also suicides. In fact, suicide was an unknown phenomenon in Kazakhstan. There was not even a word for it in the Kazakh language. And during the period of Soviet nuclear tests, the suicides just were on the rise. And for a long time, it looked as though there was no hope. But the arrival of Mikhail Gorbachev as the Soviet leader, the weakening of the Soviet system in the late 80s, allowed Kazakhstan's government and people to reclaim agency over their own fate and their land. Kazakhstan's anti-nuclear movement was called Nevada Semipalatinsk. It was created in 1989 after a regular underground nuclear test that was confirmed to release high level of radiation. And it was nice that they specifically included Nevada because the Kazakh anti-nuclear movement always saw it as part of the global fight against nuclear tests, against nuclear weapons. And it was a grassroots movement that was made up of people coming from different ethnicities. Kazakhstan is a polyethnic society, different professions, different ages. So it was really an all-nation struggle. But also, it's very moving how the international peace activists from the US, Canada, Europe, Japan, some peace activists from Russia, they helped the Kazakh anti-nuclear movement. They would come to the rallies and protests and be together. And so that incredible movement was so powerful that the Soviet military didn't have a chance to continue testing beyond October of 1989. But the protests continued because what they wanted was for the site to be shut down altogether. And that was became possible in 1991 on August 29th. Kazakh government, still a Soviet republic, still under the leadership appointed by Moscow, Kazakhstan was able to shut down the Semipalatinsk nuclear testing site and ban nuclear tests on its territory. That decision was the nation's first major step in reclaiming agency, because during the Soviet period, there wasn't much of participation in the fate of the nation. And I also want to mention the butterfly effect. So there is this massive Kazakh anti-nuclear movement that shuts down the Semipalatinsk nuclear testing site. The Soviet military continues testing for a little bit at Novaya Zemlya, but then there is Soviet moratorium on nuclear tests, then there is the US moratorium on nuclear tests, and then there is the 1996 treaty on the banning nuclear tests. So I feel that there is this important contribution that this absolutely grassroots movement contributed. And it's a story that serves as an important reminder today that there is a lot of power in ordinary people uniting behind a goal. The next stage in Kazakhstan's nuclear history is also a story that inspires and gives hope. In 1991, when the Soviet Union collapsed, Kazakhstan had more than 1,000 Soviet nuclear warheads, more than 100 intercontinental ballistic missiles, and around 40 heavy bombers that could fly and drop nuclear bombs on US mainland. Kazakhstan also had tons of nuclear material and nuclear facilities. And so if for some reason Kazakhstan, as a newly independent state, had made a decision to pursue a nuclear program, a latent nuclear program, it would have a very strong foundation, much more than, for example, Iran has at the moment. Why did a young country decide not to follow a nuclear path? And here I want to talk about security. I believe that Kazakhstan's case can be used as a counter-narrative to those who claim that nuclear weapons mean more security. Kazakhstan absolutely felt vulnerable. It was a new state, 2 nuclear powers on both sides, porous borders, no military of its own, economy in complete crisis. So definitely security concerns. However, Kazakhstan rightfully decided that nuclear weapons would not make it more secure, but quite the opposite. A new state concerned with keeping its sovereignty and statehood recognized that nuclear weapons would not help, because what Kazakhstan needed to survive as a state is to be integrated into the international community, to have access to foreign technology in order to start developing natural resources that it had so that it could boost up the economy. It wanted access to international institutions and so on. But there was also an important driver behind Kazakhstan's disarmament choice, and it was national identity building. During the Soviet period, Kazakhstan remained invisible to the outside world. I don't know how many of you, for example, knew much about Kazakhstan, and it was partly because of how the Soviet Union presented itself to the outside world, right? Everybody imagined that it was, all, Slavic people, blonde, blue eyes, but there were also all these other republics with different cultures, different ethnicities. And so finally, Kazakhstan had this chance to present itself to the outside world on its own terms. And there was this very strong normative discussion. And I actually was amazed when I worked with the archival documents from the early 90s, and I could see how the analysts, and here a disclaimer, one of the advisors was my own late father, and that they talked about, in 1991, they were talking about the NPT. And while the Kazakh leadership and the policy analysts did agree with the criticism that the NPT was a discriminatory structure, dividing into nuclear haves and have-nots, still they thought the NPT, the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, was an important norm that should not be undermined. So they accepted the norm of the NPT. And Kazakh leadership understood that choosing a nuclear path would destabilize the global nuclear order, and the country wanted to be viewed as a nation that respects international norms and does not create risks to international security. One of the phrases that I remember from my interviews with one of the key decision makers from Kazakhstan, he said, "We just didn't want to become a Central Asian North Korea." And now on the question of nuclear justice, especially noting that there is press here, I just want to reiterate that I'm speaking as a scholar. Please don't take it as a position of the country. It's really my take on what I think nuclear justice should mean for the Kazakh community. And I want to do it by addressing three questions. Who is responsible for the damage? Who is responsible for providing help? And what gives me hope? So who is responsible for the damage? All nuclear states that engaged in nuclear tests, nuclear weapons programs, and participated in the nuclear arms race, all the leaders who at some point decided that nuclear weapons should be part of their country's security architecture, share responsibility for the damage inflicted in different parts of the world to various communities. Speaking specifically about Kazakhstan, the government of the Soviet Union that chose the Kazakh land for its nuclear experiments ceased to exist in 1991. And some might say, that's the end of the story, the country doesn't exist. But a simple test to identify who carries responsibility for the legacy of the Soviet nuclear testing program and the fourth and the fifth generations of test victims in Kazakhstan is to ask, who benefits from the nuclear arsenal created at the expense of the Kazakh land and people? The answer is Russia, the sole inheritor of Soviet nuclear weapons and the main decision maker in the Soviet nuclear program. Russia obviously places nuclear weapons at the heart of its national security and uses its nuclear arsenal for blackmail. Russia, however, similar to other nuclear powers, never acknowledged any responsibility. Well, France acknowledged but didn't apologize, and more so, never offered transparency on what happened during the period of Soviet nuclear tests in Kazakhstan. For example, there is no transparency on the medical records of civilians who were observed or treated at the military hospital and even at the civilian hospital. While in the foreseeable future, Russia will not acknowledge, let alone apologize for the damage, Russia's role in the continued legacy of Soviet nuclear testing on the people of Kazakhstan must be discussed by scholars, by activists, and I think it's an important discussion. The second question, who is responsible for providing help? Even if in the fair and ideal world, Russia is the one who must take responsibility for the inflicted damage, the survivors of Soviet nuclear tests in Kazakhstan cannot wait. Affected communities need assistance now, and as citizens of Kazakhstan, they have every right to expect their own government and fellow citizens to help them. In 1992, shortly after the Soviet collapse, Kazakhstan adopted a law on social protection of nuclear test victims, and the law acknowledged the suffering of the people, established medical and social benefits. It carried both practical and symbolic meaning. However, with time, the law's shortcomings became apparent, and the law is in desperate need of revisions. I'll give you an example. The benefits apply to people who were exposed and received a dose of radiation if they continue living in the same region. If they move to another city, the benefits disappear, but the dose that they absorbed, it doesn't disappear anywhere. And at the same time, while the Kazakh government is responsible, I think, for providing medical assistance and socioeconomic help, I also feel that the society, I include myself in this group, should do its part. The general population in Kazakhstan is not fully aware of the continued legacy of the Soviet nuclear tests, and moreover, affected communities often face the stigma of being from an area contaminated by radiation. I think there is also a big role to play for the international community and the international legal instruments, and that allows me to go to the final section of my presentation, the reason for hope. And I have several. Kazakhstan made an unprecedented contribution to international security, but also to the well-being of its own people when it shut down the testing site, gave up Soviet nuclear weapons. And Kazakhstan since then really continued to be a leader, both on the disarmament, but also on the non-proliferation front. And the important treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons was discussed already several times here. And I want to mention that Kazakhstan was among the first 50 states to sign and ratify the treaty. And symbolically, they did it on August 29th of 2017. It was the 28th anniversary of shutting down the nuclear testing site. Christian already mentioned the important work that is led by Kazakhstan and Kiribati. They are both leading on Articles 6 and 7, and that's victim assistance and environment remediation. And so I just hope that Kazakhstan's leadership on the foreign policy front, that it will pull the domestic side. And this is where I see that the international legal instruments, the treaties, the TPNW are so important, because obviously countries voluntarily sign those agreements, and then it pushes them to do more internally, because they need to submit what they've done, what measures have been taken. So there is very practical application of TPNW already happening, and that's because of those. We think these are just simple reporting mechanisms, but actually they are very meaningful. And I do think that the role, the International Trust Fund will, I hope it becomes possible, because it will reflect our common responsibility that we are all residents of the same planet, and we all need solidarity, empathy, and practical help. So in conclusion, I just want to say that Kazakh communities they feel solidarity, and they're joined by downwinders in the US, including Native American tribes, Pacific Island nations, those who suffered from the US nuclear tests, also the native tribes in Southern Australia, the indigenous tribes in Algeria, people of French Polynesia, and also the Muslim minorities in Xinjiang, where the Chinese government tested nuclear weapons, and of course, solidarity with Hibakusha in Japan. And so, in addition to the formal acknowledgement of their harm, an apology to communities, and compensation for the inflicted damage from all the nuclear powers that carried out nuclear tests or used nuclear weapons, I believe true nuclear justice for these communities cannot be achieved until nuclear powers relinquish their weapons. Thank you.
I would like to thank Dr. Kassenova for her moving presentation. I feel that it's so important that we learn about the legacy of nuclear tests, especially in Kazakhstan. Because, outside of the UN, here in the US, most people don't know the story. And so it's incredibly important for us to learn about Kazakhstan and the history and the importance of the TPNW, the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. Next, we will hear from Mary Dickson, who's an author and journalist and writer. She's a cancer survivor and activist as well. Mary is an internationally recognized advocate for survivors of nuclear weapons production and testing. Her critically acclaimed play, Exposed, will be presented as a stage reading at the Players Club in New York City on April 30th, which corresponds with the next meeting of the states parties of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. So hoping that we will get many diplomats. So on that note, very pleased.
Hopefully it's a big wake-up call. Thank you so much, Ivana, for inviting me here, and thank you to all of you when you talk about what gives me hope, or us hope. It's really meeting and seeing and sharing this time with all of you. They are incredibly chaotic times, but being here, I feel such kinship, and I think I'm with my people. I just wanted to talk about what happened in the U.S. Almost 80 years after the U.S. detonated Trinity, the world's first nuclear bomb, atomic bomb actually, the casualties of our massive, I would call it misguided nuclear weapons testing program are still waiting for justice. I'm one of those casualties. I'm what's known as a downwinder. I'm a survivor of 4 decades of nuclear testing that devastated my family and my childhood neighborhood and far, far beyond. I grew up in Salt Lake City, a child of the 50s and 60s. We played in puddles of rainwater. We mixed vanilla and sugar with snow to pretend it was ice cream. We ate vegetables from the garden, and we drank milk that was delivered to our doorsteps every morning from a local dairy. Sometimes when we visited my grandfather, his friend would let us drink it straight from the cows. How were any of us to know that a silent poison was spreading its way through our bodies when a government we trusted assured us there is no danger and distributed pamphlets telling us not to let reports of Geiger counters going crazy bother us? All of this while hundreds of nuclear bombs, many times more powerful than those that destroyed Hiroshima and Nagasaki, were exploded in the Nevada desert just 40 minutes from Las Vegas and 350 miles from where I was living. Like thousands of communities across America, we lived under the deadly clouds of radioactive fallout from those blasts. We were collateral damage of the Cold War. Between 1951 and 1962, the US government detonated 100 nuclear bombs above ground in Nevada. And when atmospheric tests were bombed in 1963, they moved them underground until a moratorium was declared in 1992. But they exploded 828 bombs underground. So we exploded in Nevada 928 nuclear bombs, more than any other country, and we did 10 tests elsewhere in the US, including in Colorado, in New Mexico, and in, where else? Alaska. Yeah, Alaska. So those, and a lot of the underground tests, they said they were safer, but a lot of them broke through the Earth crust, and it released radioactive fallout into the atmosphere. If you look at some of the photos, they look just like above-ground tests. The mushroom clouds were so huge. In the US, the winds blow from the west to the east, and they carried fallout across the country, thousands of miles beyond the test site, all the way to the East Coast. When it collided with rain or snow, it worked its way into the ecosystem, the food chain, and our bodies, causing untold numbers of cancers and radiation-related illnesses in communities nationwide, including, there was one test that was, the winds changed direction, and it fell out in Los Angeles. It was 1958, there was a massive inversion, and it was trapped in that inversion for 6 days. John Goffman, who worked on the Manhattan Project, predicted how many people would die from that test. It was measured in Missouri, where people were sickened. It actually, one test collided with the worst thunderstorm in 100 years in Albany, Troy, and Schenectady, New York. And people are still living with those consequences. And it went all the way into Canada, which violated international treaty, and it was measured by a professor at a university there. So we were repeatedly exposed to dangerous levels of fallout without our knowledge or consent. The ongoing human cost of almost 1,000 blasts has been devastating. And documents show that the government, as it was deciding where to move testing, when it was too expensive in the Pacific, they decided they better move it. They chose Nevada, even though meteorologists at the time warned them that in this country, because the winds go from west to east, it would be carried across the entire nation. So in the haste to win the Cold War arms race, they were willing to sacrifice their own. We basically became expendable. My life has been shaped by what happened to me at the hands of my own government, not just me, but my family and so many people I love. I was in my late 20s when I was diagnosed with thyroid cancer, which is caused by iodine-131 exposure. Surgeons cut out my thyroid and the lymph nodes around it, and then they gave me what they called a cocktail of radioactive iodine to drink. My hospital door and bracelet was a symbol for radiation. I was the radioactive material. A doctor stood outside my hospital room every day to point a Geiger counter at me until it was safe for me to be around people again. When I was released, he told me to avoid pregnant women and children for a while and not to get pregnant for a year. I never could get pregnant. In following years, another surgery left me unable to have children. And subsequent health scares have taken an emotional toll as well. I've been sliced, radiated, and scooped out. I've buried and mourned the dead, comforted and advocated for the living, and worried with each pain, ache, and lump that I'm getting sick again. I survived, but so many others did not. My older sister suffered lupus for 9 years. She was only 46 when she took her last breath as we stood around her hospital bed with her 3 children. And that death rocked our family. I know people who suffered far more deaths than theirs. My younger sister's now battling a stomach cancer that will likely kill her. And my youngest sister struggles with autoimmune disorders. Too many of our friends and neighbors have become ill or died. I counted 54 people in my childhood neighborhood who developed cancers, tumors, autoimmune disorders, and other illnesses that ravaged their families, as well as infertility, miscarriages, and babies born with birth defects. A grade school classmate of mine died when she was 10 of a brain tumor. 4 weeks later, her 4-year-old brother died of testicular cancer. Their devastated mother asked their pediatrician if it was a coincidence that 10 other people in the neighborhood had brain tumors as well. And the casualties, I have to tell you, continue to mount. I'm still meeting people from that neighborhood who had cancer. And of all the downwinders I worked most closely with in Utah, I'm the only one still living. One of them died after enduring multiple cancers, and she would always say, we're veterans of the Cold War, only we never enlisted, and nobody will ever fold a flag over our coffins. And as painful as it is, I feel an incredible responsibility to tell our stories and keep them alive. My cousin, who lost her husband to colon cancer, always reminds me, your story didn't end tragically, so that you can carry the tragic story forward. And I've written and spoken widely about the human toll of testing. I've listened to hundreds of gut-wrenching stories, and they're the reason I fight for justice and advocate to expand compensation. We didn't see compensation in the US until 1990 with the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act. It was incredibly limited. It only covered a handful of counties. It didn't even cover all of Utah. We wait for Congress to act, but more people die each day while we wait and fight. We've gone to DC multiple times to meet with members of Congress. Last March, we actually saw the bill to expand it. It passed the Senate 69-30, bipartisan. Never made it to the floor House because Speaker Mike Johnson said it would cost too much, even though we have already borne the cost. We'll never know how many people died or became sick from their radiation exposure. I have to say that the vast majority of downwinders will never know they are. And most Americans, sadly, still don't know how far the fallout spread or that they themselves could have been affected. Plus, when cancers show up decades after exposure, it's hard to connect the dots. And we know, as Jimmy said last night, that radiation is still with us. It's still in the biosphere. This isn't a story from the past, as so many people assume. It's very much part of our present. People are still being diagnosed. They suffer health complications. Their cancers return. They face crippling medical bills. And the psychological toll, like our scars, runs deep. And worse, the genetic damage can be passed to future generations. We will forever be living with fallout. For too many of us, the Cold War has never ended. We continue to suffer because of our government's recklessness, a government that knew the lethal and lasting effects of nuclear detonations, but for the sake of deterrence, killed its own. As one author I know said, testing did not prevent nuclear war, it was a nuclear war. And now our government plans to invest more than $1 trillion over the next 30 years to upgrade our nuclear arsenal. China and Russia are also upgrading theirs. We are on the verge of a new arms race. And this is what's most alarming. Preparations are already underway for possible resumption of testing. They've built new tunnels at the Nevada test site and new roads. Which leads me to ask, have we learned nothing from our tragic past? The voices of those of us who have lived with the devastating and continuing effects of nuclear weapons must be heard in any discussion of this planet's nuclear future. Our insights, our perspectives, are as important as the voices of think tanks, experts, and policymakers. Our lived experience and our stories must serve as a warning and as a call to action. And I am hoping beyond hope that we all work together to help secure a nuclear-free world where future generations will never have to live with the same fears and consequences we've endured, because we all live downwind. And I just want to show you the map of where fallout went in the US. It's Richard Miller from his book Under the Clouds, The Decades of Nuclear Testing. He only put a dot on a map of the US when a test trajectory intersected 3 times. He said if he did it for all the testing, the whole country would be blacked out. It's shocking and troubling, but that's why it's so, so important. We never, ever let it happen again, and we rid our beautiful planet of these weapons. Anyone who wants a map, I brought little cards. Thank you, Ivana.
Thank you so much, Mary, for your moving testimony about the U.S. nuclear tests. So we're running short on time, but we're going to try to have some Q&A interactive discussions with everyone here. Before I open up the floor, since we're at the Choose Hope conference, many of our speakers talked about the significance of the TPNW, especially the humanitarian provisions contained in Articles 6 and 7. So I was wondering if several of you would like to talk about the need for the state parties to establish an international trust fund now instead of postponing it. Thank you.
I will say right away, they need to do it now because the victims are literally dying. Oh, the victims are literally dying. We are a dwindling population, and they must take care of people. My government especially.
I think, obviously there is a huge practical meaning of the International Trust Fund, but there is also something about shared humanity. It troubles me that these communities are kind of left on their own, and we don't see it as a shared problem. We see it as a problem of a specific category. So I think it's just so important on some existential philosophical level that it will show that actually, countries see themselves as being together in this, as all fellow citizens of this planet. But Christian, it's just something that I forgot to mention, what also gives me hope. I also wanted to reiterate the role of the young generation. For example, for those of you who were in New York last week, or maybe you'll find them on Instagram, but there are amazing initiatives in Kazakhstan led by young people. One is called STEP, Organization for Peace, Kazakh Youth for Nuclear Justice. And then the other one is Kazakh Nuclear Frontline Coalition. And it's just incredible. I think when I see them, because they're not cynical, they're not saying it's not possible, they're just doing their thing. And so to any of you who, I don't know, have any say, or maybe you know how to involve younger voices, not for us to put responsibility on them, but rather give them equal say, because it's their planet, and they have more time on this planet than the previous generation. So just, shout out to all the young people.
I want to echo what Mary said in your presentation, that I think survivors and those who had to go through the effects of nuclear weapons are the foremost experts, because they really know what it means to survive nuclear weapons use, and their voices must be recognized the most. And I was fortunate enough to join this movement when the TPNW was starting to take shape, and observe the discussions at the UN where really survivors' voices led the way. Where the discourse about nuclear weapons shifted from the one that's very abstract, theory-based, sterilized, talking about tactical nuclear weapons, low-yield nuclear weapons, which could still kill thousands of people, by the way, to really about human suffering. And because of that, as Ambassador White mentioned today, we have the TPNW because of their voice, in addition to everybody else's leadership. So I really feel we owe it to the survivors. Because of them, we have this treaty, and I think because of that, it makes it right that we have this trust fund right away. And as mentioned, the one more year that we postpone the decision, more people are dying and more people are struggling. So, as SGI too, we have been really keenly following the process, and we also think as many stakeholders should be able to contribute to the fund, because we want to support as many survivors and as many affected communities to be able to benefit from the fund.
Thank you very much. And the ICRC also wanted to to support the creation of the trust fund, and we are part of the discussion. So let's choose hope.
Yes, the trust fund is incredibly important, as well as youth engagement. And as Dr. Kassenova mentioned, it is very important that we uplift and support affected communities. That's why we at the Nuclear Age Peace Foundation, we were so incredibly proud to be able to support 3 young women from Christmas Island in Kiribati to attend the 3rd meeting of state parties. And we were very fortunate that several of our affiliated youth members who are here in the audience, including Stella Dean Rose and Kenneth Chu, were really able to work and collaborate with them and encourage them to share their voices with the media. Now, I know that time is very, very short, so perhaps we'll take one question from the audience. Does anyone have a burning question? I see that, please.
Thanks, I'm Bob Lingdorf from LA. First of all, I wanted to express my sympathy to Mary for what she's gone through all this time. And I've visited the Nevada and Las Vegas testing museum, which is really enlightening. So if anybody hasn't visited there, I'd recommend that. My question is for either Anna or Mary. When I was in the 70s at the University of Missouri, I saw the raw documentary of the Hiroshima victims that was so graphic and so hard to watch that I actually, it's the only time in my life I had to turn away from film and not see it. But I think it was subsequently banned, but I wondered, do you know if that is still available? That should be shown to all the congressmen.
Yeah, they should see a lot of things. I know that this country I know that the government for years tried to keep the results of Hiroshima and Nagasaki covered up. They didn't want people to see what it did. The same way they didn't want them to know about testing and what it did, because they were worried that people would demand it stop. So extensive propaganda, but the first reporter actually to go into Hiroshima afterwards was from a black newspaper. And his daughter later said that what he saw so destroyed him, he was never the same. I don't know if it's available. It would be worth looking up.
Thank you.
I know that time is super short, but I know that Professor Kuznak has a question.
I was just going to respond to that. The documentary you're talking about is called Hiroshima and Nagasaki, 1945. It was made by Eric Bardow from Columbia, released on PBS in 1970. That was the first one. Since then, there's been Black Light, White Rain, and a couple others were very good ones that have come out. But the government classified and censored all that footage until 1968, when Bardow was able to get a hold of it. So they didn't want us to know. They didn't want people to see what our bombs do.
Thank you. Any other questions? I see Melissa Park from ICANN, please.
Thank you so much for this wonderful panel presentations and moving stories. At the third meeting of States Parties last week, Inamura Cross from French Polynesia talked about the language that's used, and she talked specifically about the word testing and saying we need to find another way of talking about them because
Thank you so much. And then on that note, I would like to conclude this panel, and I believe that we're going to take a very short break. So thank you all.